All right, the English Reformation, starting off with Catholics and Protestants and this question of what's the difference? So last week I opened up this one, so we all know the answer to this one. The defining feature of a Catholic is allegiance to the Pope. And by the same token, a Protestant is a Christian, at least in the European or especially Western European context, it's a Christian who doesn't owe allegiance to the Pope. There are other Christian churches, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Ethiopian churches, you know, there are Coptic churches, there are churches that are outside the Catholic and Protestant dichotomy, but we'll just focus on Western Europe and the church as it is in Europe. Okay, so basically in that context, a Protestant is a Christian who doesn't owe allegiance to the Pope, and a Catholic is a Christian who does. That's the basic situation. Now, if we look at the sorts of differences between Catholics and Protestants, we've got things like Catholics have not only the Bible, but they have 1,000 years of church tradition by the 16th century. At the time of this Reformation, they've got 1,000 years of history. Catholics have been around for a long time in Western Europe, and they have had various policies, various ideas that they've introduced that were not originally in the Bible. Okay? So they developed their own traditions. And those traditions were accepted by the Catholic Church as being part of the Christian religion. Whereas the Protestants said, no, many of these traditions that the Catholic Church has developed are not really part of what Christianity should be. The Bible doesn't say anything about those things. And so therefore, we don't think that we should believe those things. We don't think that we should follow those traditions. So in Latin, they call this sola scriptura, only the Bible, only the religious writings. We don't follow the church tradition, the Protestants said. We just follow the Bible. So that was one of the differences. Another difference was justification. Now, justification is a difficult idea, but what justifies you to go to heaven? When you're dead and you go knocking on the door, excuse me, can I come in? Okay, why should we let you in? Okay, why do you have a right to come to heaven? Now, for Christians, this was an important question. And the Catholic thing was, well, I lived a good life. I gave money to charity. When I did something bad, I punished myself. Okay, if I did something bad, I would not eat food for a period of time, or I would go down on my knees and I would pray for a very hard time, for many long hours. And I would even take a little whip and I would hit myself to punish myself for bad things that I did. Isn't that enough? Can't I get into heaven with that? And that's what basically the Catholic teaching at that time was emphasizing. Protestants said, no, wait a minute, if we look at the Bible, it doesn't say that. What the Bible is basically saying is, hello, can I come into heaven? Why? Why should we take you? Because I believe, because I have faith, because I trust in Jesus Christ who died for us. Oh, well, in that case, come in. Okay, that was the way they saw it. You were justified by faith. That's the way they understood the teaching of the Bible, and they didn't agree with the Catholic thinking that it was because you lived a good life and you gave money to charity and you punished yourself if you did bad things. So today, the two churches, the Catholic and the Protestant Church, are not so clearly divided on that topic. Mostly Catholics would say, well, you have to believe in God and you have to live a good life. And most Protestants would say the same thing. But in those days, it was Catholics on one side and Protestants on the other side. So it's not quite like this today, but it was like that in those days. The next thing was that the Catholics believed in free will. You came to this earth and you choose by your actions, you choose by what you do, if you go to heaven or if you go to hell after you die. You live this life, you have the choice. And that's what this life is all about. But the Protestants read the Bible, and in the Bible it talks about the book of life. The book of life. And right at the beginning, people's names were written in the book of life. And if your name was written in the book of life right at the beginning, that was because you were going to go to heaven. You were predestined. Your fate was decided even before you were born. So this is connected with the last one. You have to trust, you have to have faith, you have to believe that your name is in that book. Otherwise, you're not going to get to heaven. Okay? So it's not to do with how you live. You can do all the good things you like on this earth, but if you don't have faith that your name is in that book, in the book of life, you're not going to go to heaven. Okay? So predestination. Again, the Catholics believed that there was heaven and hell, and there was a different place, a third place called purgatory. So when you died, people would say, well, what do you think? Is he in heaven? They'd say, well, I don't know, he was okay, he was not a bad person. Well, do you think he's in hell? Oh, I don't think he was bad enough to go to hell. I don't think he was good enough to go to heaven either. Let's put him somewhere else. Let's put him in an in-between place. And after he's dead, he can purify himself. He can purify himself. And over 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years, he will purify himself, and in the end, he will go into heaven. Let's say there's another place called purgatory, where people can purge themselves of their evil nature. And then when they are pure, they can go into heaven. And this was strongly connected with the church structure, the Catholic church structure. People would pray for their dead father, their dead mother, okay, or somebody they loved. And the church would say, if you light a candle, or if you buy a special piece of paper, they will have to spend less time in purgatory. You can help the dead people. Okay? And also for yourself, you can buy special pieces of paper or special things that will give you less time in purgatory, and you can go to heaven more quickly. And so the church was getting money out of this idea of purgatory. Protestants read the Bible. There's no purgatory in the Bible. It's just heaven and hell. So they wanted to kick out the idea of purgatory. Another important thing was the Catholics had this idea of penance, which is something you do. Like I said, you punish your body, you punish yourself for bad things you do. I'm terribly, terribly sorry that I did this. And you can either do an act of charity. I did a terribly bad thing, so now I'm going to give money to start a new hospital, or I'm going to give money to starving children, or something like that. Or I'm going to punish myself in some way. Okay, they would whip their bodies. They would not eat for periods of time. It was called penance. It still exists in the Catholic Church to some extent, penance. But the Protestants said this is a mistake in the Bible. The translation into Latin was wrong. The true meaning should be repentance, which is not actions, but it's a feeling in your heart. You feel sorry genuinely inside your heart. People can do penance. A man could, for example, say, oh, I slept with a prostitute last week. Oh, that was very naughty of you. Now you slap your wrist and oh, I'm so sorry, and now I won't do it again. And then next week I'll go and then I'll say sorry again, and I'll go again, and I'll keep saying sorry, you see. No. Unless you really feel sorry in your heart, and you're not really not going to do this again. Okay, that's what the Protestants understood. It's not about giving yourself little punishments or saying, okay, I'm terribly sorry that I slept with a prostitute, I'll give some money to charity instead, or something like that. No, that didn't work for the Protestants. They said that's not the way the Bible expresses it. The Bible expresses it, you have to be truly sorry in your heart. Okay? So they wanted repentance, not penance. And Another important one would be that the way the Catholic Church had grown up, Mary was almost like a female god. She was almost like a goddess inside the church. And the Protestants said, no, look, if you read the Bible, she's not really a very important person. She just happens to be. She's not even a particularly good person. She just happens to be the mother of Jesus Christ. There's nothing special about her. She's not a saint. She's not a special, she's not, we shouldn't be thinking about her in that sort of special way. She's not special in that way. So that was another big difference. And I'll just go through quickly one or two more. Catholics often, they pray for the dead. And like I said, praying for the dead, Protestants would say that's an insult to God. The dead are already in heaven or hell. Nothing you can do will change that. No prayers will change it. As soon as they die, they are in heaven or they are in hell. And praying makes no difference. It's like a bujoku to God to suggest, oh, please God, let them go to heaven. No, it's already decided, it's already finished, and you should not interfere with it. Confession of sins, okay, going to the priest and sort of in a special little box and saying all the bad things that you did. That's church tradition, Catholic church tradition. It's not in the Bible. There's nothing that says you have to go to a priest and you have to say all the bad things you did and the priest will forgive you or something. No. So again, the Protestants basically usually wouldn't want that. Ritual. The church had developed all sorts of, statues and ceremonies and kind of complicated, and some of them very beautiful. But the Protestants said no. It should be as simple as possible. Okay, it depends again on the Protestant church. Some Protestant churches have more ceremony, more, artwork and things. But in general, Protestant churches are, by comparison with Catholic churches, very simple places. Some of the Protestant churches have nothing. Just look the same as this room now. Nothing to indicate that it's a church. Okay, just very simple. Somewhere for people to sit, and that's all. Okay. Prayers that repeat themselves. You say the same prayer again and again and again. Catholics have beads, and they use the bead to count. They say the same prayer again and again, and then when they go around all the beads, that's one cycle of saying the same prayer. And they say it again and again and again and again, like a mantra. Protestants usually don't agree with that. When in church, there's this, one of the church ceremonies that most Protestant churches also have is taking the bread and the wine. And they say that it's Jesus Christ's flesh and it's his blood in the wine. Yeah, it's a church ceremony. Everybody goes up to the front of the church, the priests sort of make a sign and then give them the bread and the wine. For Catholics, that is really Christ's flesh. It's really Christ's blood. But those Protestant churches that have the ceremony, some don't have the ceremony, but those that have the ceremony would say, no, it's only symbolic. Okay, it's not real, it's just a symbol, it's not real. So those would be some of the differences, okay, that there would exist between Catholics and Protestants. And some of them would have been more important in the 16th century than they are now. All right, but the really big thing that was going on in the 16th century that was making a lot of people angry was this thing about penance and the way that penance was being used for the church to get money, to make itself rich. And not the idea of repentance. The very first thing that Martin Luther talked about was this idea of penance. That's the first thing that he criticized. Okay, that's not true Christianity. True Christianity is you have to feel sorry in your heart. It's not about giving money to the church or getting like that kind of sort of omamori kinds of things that are going to make, that doesn't work. That's all a trick as far as he was concerned. Okay, so that's the basic position there. Okay then, so let's get going on the Reformation as it was in the 16th century and what was going on. We've got this Catholic Church which had existed for hundreds of years and it had been developing its traditions through what were called church councils, and so all these things had grown up that were in the Catholic Church that weren't actually in the Bible. And the one that was going to cause all the trouble was going to be the doctrine, well, a lot of the trouble was the doctrine of penance. There were others, of course, but penance was one of the biggest ones. The selling of pardons, the selling of indulgences that would buy forgiveness of sins and shorten the amount of time that people were going to spend in purgatory. Okay, that's what they were supposed to do. But of course, their real purpose, their main purpose, was to bring money into the church. And the church was living quite comfortably. The church was incredibly rich at this time. And part of it was because people were buying these pardons, buying these indulgences. So they were giving their money to the church, thinking that that was going to get them into heaven. And the Bible doesn't say anything about anything like that. So that was one of the major things underlying the feeling of anger that people had at the church. Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk in Germany, he nailed his complaints against the church to the church door, and as I say, penance was at the top of the list. There were 95 different points that he raised, but penance was the one that came in at the top. And popular feeling just grew from there. He didn't know that he was making a new church. He thought that he was a Catholic monk, he was an Augustinian monk. He thought that the church would listen to him and say, oh yeah, that's true, we should change what we're doing. But no, the church said, if you want to talk like that, you're out. You're out of our church. So then everybody who agreed with Luther had to go and make their own church separately. So that's how the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church divided, because the Catholic Church was not ready to listen to what Luther was complaining about. And there were others in Europe. These three names would be perhaps the most famous in Europe at that time: Melanchthon, Calvin, and Zwingli. And these three also spoke out against the Catholic Church, and that's why you get these different Protestant churches, because they didn't always agree with each other. All right, there would be some debate among them about, what was the right way to understand the Bible and what was the right way to make the church work. So you got new Protestant churches being set up. And okay, England itself was a special case, very special case, because it really, if we take a look at the way things developed over the 16th century, first thing is to understand that it was not a short and straight process that just happened quickly. Henry VIII, who began the Protestant reform in England, was not a Protestant. He was a strong Catholic, and in the early part of his reign, from the time he became king in 1509 until about 1533, England was a Catholic country, and its king was, a strong supporter of Catholicism, very strong supporter of Catholicism. Henry was such a strong supporter of Catholicism that the Pope was very happy to give him the title Fidei Defensor in Latin, and that means defender of the faith. He attacked Luther. He disagreed with Martin Luther, and he wrote a paper against Luther, and the Pope was very pleased with Henry. So he gave him this special title, Fidei Defensor, which we still use. Look at Queen Elizabeth here on some modern English money. She's Elizabeth II, Dei Gratia Regina, Queen by grace of God, and she is FD, Fidei Defensor. She's a defender of the faith. Ironic, because it's a different faith. England left the Catholic Church after this, so she's a Fidei Defensor, but it's not the faith that the Pope gave her, gave Henry VIII the special title for. So it's kind of ironic, really, that they use that, but that's still being used. And so, to start off with then, it was a Catholic country. Now this little bar here is to show you how the country swings across backwards and forwards over the 16th century. Because what happens next is that Henry wants a divorce. We talked about this last week, and so he wants a divorce, or more strictly speaking, an annulment from his first marriage. And as a result, he is excommunicated. That means he's kicked out. He's kicked out from the Catholic Church. The Pope says, you are not a member of our church now because you disobeyed me. So also Henry closed the monasteries, and he allowed the Bible to be translated into English and published and spread out across the country in English. Before that, it was forbidden to translate the Bible into English. So the country went from being Catholic to being, well, not exactly Protestant. It was sort of in between, because basically Henry agreed with the Catholics. He just had a disagreement with the Pope. But most of the Catholic teaching he accepted, so he wasn't really Protestant. And the church at that time wasn't really a Protestant church. It did change over the 15 years or so that we're talking about here, or 13, 14 years that we're talking about. It did change, sometimes it was more Catholic, sometimes it was more Protestant. Henry's policies changed because he was trying to decide which way to go. Okay? But it was always somewhere in the middle. It was never clearly, it never went back to accepting the Pope, so it was never completely Catholic, and it never really went into the direction that the Protestants went. In fact, some Protestant reformers, most famous of them will be Anne Askew, a woman who was burned to death because she insisted on Protestant ideas. And Henry burned her, and other Protestants were put to death by Henry because he didn't agree with the basic Protestant teaching. Okay? So the church was somewhere in the middle at that stage. And then Henry died, and his son Edward was king. Well, Edward was only 9 years old when he became king, and he died when he was 15. So he was controlled mostly by his advisors, and his advisors were basically Protestant. So the English church at this stage went over in a much more strongly Protestant direction under Edward. But he didn't live for very long, and when he died, his sister, Mary, became queen. Now, she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the Catholic Spanish princess, and she'd been brought up as a Catholic. So she immediately said, no, stop all this Protestant stuff. Let's go back to the Pope. Let's go back to being Catholics. And for the period of her reign, for 5 or 6 years, England was now completely, again, a Catholic country. So the pendulum swung over into Protestant and then back into Catholic. Mary was known as Bloody Mary because she put many Protestants to death. Many Protestants were burned or put to death during her reign, several hundred. All right, she wasn't as bloody as her father, but she did punish quite a lot of prominent Protestants at that time. And again, though, she didn't live for all that long. She died, and Elizabeth came in, the second daughter. Now, she had been brought up as a Protestant, so she took the church over in a Protestant direction. Not as strongly Protestant as Edward, as it had been under Edward, but fairly much over into a Protestant direction. She did allow some flexibility, as we'll see. This is called the Elizabethan settlement. This is in 1559. And it led to what was called the Via Media in Latin, which means the middle way. Middle way. because the church is sort of somewhere in between Catholic and Protestant belief. Even today, the Church of England has a variety. Some churches, we call them high church. High church is closer to Catholic, and low church is closer to Protestant. If you go into a high church Anglican church, you'll see lots of the things that look very similar to a Catholic church. The incense, the St. Call that they burn in the church, they'll have that. The candles, a lot of the sort of sense of ceremony, and it's very similar to a Catholic church. Okay, some people call that sort of Roma ho nashi, no, Catholic Kushubi. Okay, it's Catholicism but without the Pope. So it's almost the same as Catholic, but there's no Pope. And then the low church is much closer to the Protestants of Europe, the Protestant churches of Europe. Simple, no ceremonies, no statues to Mary, or no statues at all, that sort of thing. So it's more closely sort of over in the Protestant area. And so this was the sort of middle way of the church that Elizabeth set up. Why did she do it like that? Well, she wanted to attract as many people as possible. She said, you Protestants, come into my church. It's sort of, you Catholics, come into my church. Okay, let's get as many people in here as we can. All right? And it was illegal not to go. You had to go to church. All right? What you believed inside your head might be different. You might not believe in it. You might say, I'm a Catholic, but shoganai kara, I have to go, so I'll go to the Catholic, the Church of England. But in my heart, I'm still a Catholic. And some of the very strong Protestants were the same. I want a more Protestant church, but shoganai kara, I have to go to the Church of England. So, but she just wanted to get as many people, who to accept it as possible. So she wanted a fairly broad middle ground between the Catholic and the Protestant ideologies. So, okay, take a look at that then. You can see that the 16th century was a pretty unsettled time. Starting off with England as a Catholic country, then going to England being somewhere in between, then over for a few years into a Protestant direction, then fully back again to Catholicism, and then back to this sort of middle way. Okay? All right. I made a mistake on the print, so I was going to take all those names out and you would write them in yourselves to help you to remember, but they're in there for you already, so you don't have to do anything. But that's basically the way that the church kind of moved its way towards being this sort of middle kind of church. It wasn't as Protestant as the European Protestants, but it wasn't Catholic either. And after 1559, things stabilised, and the church kept a fairly, kept to that position after 1559. There are no big swings of the pendulum, except during the 17th century, in the middle of the 17th century, as we shall see, there was a Puritan revolution, and the strong Protestants, the very Protestant group, the Puritan group, they took control of the country under Oliver Cromwell. And at that time, the Church, the Church of England was closed down, and only the Puritan churches remained for a few years. So, apart from that little period, the Church of England has basically taken the position that Elizabeth kind of got it started along, that sort of middle way between the Catholic and the Protestant ideologies. Okay, so yes, I want to get away from the idea that the Reformation just sort of happened, as a short thing, and suddenly everybody became Protestant. That was the way that we learned about it when I was at university, more or less. It was something that happened. Whereas now, especially over the last 20 years or so, scholars have been saying, no, come on, you can't think about it like that. It's something that happened over a long period of time. It started before Luther. There were people who were against the Catholic Church back in the 14th century in England, trying to translate the Bible and things like that, and challenging the Catholic Church. And it really doesn't end until, the 18th century. You've got these changes that are going on. It's a long process. So it would be a mistake to think that, one morning people woke up and that's it, England isn't a Catholic country anymore. It changed in 1559, it changed, and it was never a Catholic country after 1559, but there were still lots of Catholics around. Okay, and I'll be trying today to explain a little bit about what it might have been like. We really need, especially, as we're studying the English history at this period, to understand that the idea that the English were suffering under Mary and that they were very happy to go back to being Protestants when Elizabeth came into power. Again, that's what I learned, that's what I was brought up with, okay? That was the kind of history they were teaching when I was your sort of age. But that's been really deconstructed now, and people are saying, no. There was a lot of resistance to the Elizabethan settlement, and anyway, even after the Elizabethan settlement, there was Catholicism carrying on in the country to a large extent. Even though the state religion was now the church, the Protestant Church of England, really there was still a very long struggle that was going to go on between Catholics and Protestants, and was going to last, through a lot of the period that we're interested in, a lot of this Tudor Stuart period. So we really need to understand a little bit about it. Recent scholarship shows that there was a lot more Catholic literature, a lot more Catholic culture in Elizabethan times than people used to think. And that's been one of my, I'm not a Catholic or a Protestant, okay, but that's been one of my research specialisms. So I can tell you all about this. And I'd like to look at the topic in relation to one very, very important person from that period. Shakespeare. Now, I choose Shakespeare partly because there are big arguments about whether Shakespeare himself was a Catholic, but more than that, I choose this because it's not the argument about whether he's a Protestant or a Catholic that matters to me. What matters to me is he was a typical person from that period. Let's look at his life, let's look at his culture, let's look at his situation, and we can understand that that was typical for people. Okay? If we look at the example of Shakespeare, let's think, for example, his grandparents. They would have been alive at the time that Henry VIII made the first break because of his divorce or annulment. And all through that time, the Church of England stayed basically Catholic. So people would see themselves as kind of basically Catholics, but the king had a quarrel with the Pope. So, and at the time that Shakespeare was born, England had really, the Elizabethan settlement was only 5 years before Shakespeare was born. So Catholicism was part of the landscape, it was part of the culture. His parents, his grandparents, his friends, okay? They would all have been connected with Catholicism in some way. Look at that. Here's Shakespeare, here's Catholicism. Are they connected? Is there some sort of connection? Is there some sort of relationship? What sort of relationship is there? All right? That's what I want to take a look at and show, not trying to prove whether Shakespeare was a Catholic or not, but just trying to show that somebody who was living at this time, as Shakespeare was, would certainly have connections with Catholicism because it was part of the culture. All right? So firstly, let's look at his Catholic connections. And they're strong Catholic connections. His mother particularly, Mary Arden, she came from a strongly Catholic family. And when he was 19 years old, his cousin had his head cut off and stuck on a stick because he helped a Catholic priest. Now, it wasn't illegal to believe in Catholicism. Elizabeth didn't want to stop people from, she said you can't control what people believe. But she could control Catholic priests, from going around teaching Catholicism. And so a Catholic priest was in danger of his life. And anybody who helped a Catholic priest was in danger of their life. And Shakespeare's cousin had his head cut off and stuck on a pike, that's a long stick, to show it to the rest of the people in the town to say, don't do what he did, okay? Learn the lesson. Don't cooperate with the Catholics. Don't help Catholic priests or you're dead. Okay, and that happened to Shakespeare's cousin. The area he grew up in, Stratford, was quite strongly Catholic. And it's possible also that he went to a place called Lancaster in the north of England. There's a period of Shakespeare's life we don't really know what he was doing. And there's a theory that he went up to Lancaster at that time and stayed with a family called the Houghtons, who were a noted Catholic family. Well, if that's true, then the possibility that Shakespeare was a Catholic himself gets stronger. But it's not sure whether it's true or not. Even without that, the area that he grew up in was quite well known for having lots of Catholic sympathisers in that area. And his school, King's New School in Stratford, had many Catholic schoolmasters and it had many Catholic students. His first teacher became a Jesuit in 1575, Jesuit, Jesuskai, okay, strongly Catholic. And another student from that school became a Catholic priest in 1586. So, Shakespeare was in that same school that produced, Catholic priests. So, those kinds of connections were going on for him. Also, you've got the fact that his father's will, saying about his property, what should happen to his property, that was discovered in 1757, and that was clearly Catholic in the way that it was expressed. We don't know if it was true or not because the will was found in 1757 and then it got burnt, it got destroyed in a fire. So we can't look at it now. We can't really see if it was really truly his will. But if it was true, then his father was also a Catholic. When he got married in a church that was said to have, a priest who supported Catholicism, secretly. It's a bit. You've got to think in this time that Catholics are a little bit like the Kakuri Kirishitan, in Japan. They would be secretive about what they were doing. So you could have a priest. If a priest openly said, "I'm a Catholic," then he would have to hide. And he'd have to spend his whole life hiding from the authorities. But you had other priests who did sort of, I'm not going to tell anyone, but when you come in the church and we close the door, I'm going to give basically a Catholic teaching. That's what I really in my heart believe. And inside this church, with the door closed, I know you're all my neighbours, I've known you all my life, I know that you all agree with me. Okay? So that kind of thing was going on. And his father and his daughter were both fined. If you didn't go to church, you had to pay money. And his father refused to go to church. Possibly he refused to go to church because he said, I won't go into the Protestant church. I'm a Catholic and I don't want to go into the Protestant church. And his daughter did the same thing. There were other reasons for people refusing to go into church, but that was one of the big reasons. So again, it's a kind of fairly strong suggestion that he might have been that they might have been Catholics, and obviously they're very close to Shakespeare himself. And you've also, You've also got, as we saw last week, the closing of the monasteries, and Shakespeare in his writings talks about bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang, which seems to be lamenting and saying, you know, his sad feeling that the monasteries were closed. These, isn't it sad? The choirs are now ruined, and the sweet birds used to sing the songs of religion in here, and now it's all in ruins because of the Reformation, because of Henry. So it looks like he's expressing regret for what happened. And in his play, Henry VIII, he goes even further, and he says, those that can pity here may, if they think it well, let forth a tear. If you can feel pity, if you can feel sorry, you might want to cry when you think about what's happened. So, but the problem is, of course, that Henry VIII is a fictional play. He's not necessarily saying his own opinion all the time. In a drama, you know, Hamlet wants to commit suicide. He talks about suicide. That doesn't mean to say that Shakespeare wants to commit suicide, does it? It's a fiction. It's a story. So the same thing happening here. These lines come in a fiction. Should we believe that that's what Shakespeare himself thinks? Maybe, maybe not. But there are people who argue that Shakespeare, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about a very famous Catholic of the time, Robert Parsons, a Jesuit priest, very open. Okay, so when he came to England, he would be hiding. He spent a lot of his time in Europe, but he wrote and he wrote and he wrote, and he published books which were sent into England against the Protestant Church and attacking the Protestant Church and standing up for the Catholic Church. So again, you know, he was a well-known Jesuit priest, he was a contemporary of Shakespeare's, and is there a relationship between those two? Well, there is actually. So I'd like to examine, I'd like to explore, you know, just show you that these two, the famous English dramatist and the Catholic priest, had some kind of connection between them. Part of the connection would come from Shakespeare actually mentioning Parsons twice in two of his plays. In Love's Labour's Lost and in Twelfth Night, he mentions him twice. He talks about this Parsons person in his plays. Also, Parsons' most famous book was called A Christian Directory, and Shakespeare mentions a Christian directory, or he doesn't mention it, but he uses phrases from it. He takes little bits, and you can see, even in that famous "to be or not to be, that is the question," in that speech, there are bits of it which are clearly taken from Parsons. So he'd obviously read it. But just before we get too carried away, Parsons' book was popular. It was the most popular book of religion at that time. Not just among Catholics, but it was adapted by a Protestant for use by Protestants. So it was very widely read. It went through dozens and dozens of editions. It was republished and republished many times in Shakespeare's lifetime. It was a very, very popular book. Almost everybody read it. Okay, it was the #1 big hit. Okay, in those days. So to say that Shakespeare used it is not such a big surprise. That's what I'm trying to say. You see, this kind of Catholic culture was around everybody. And also, Parsons refers to Shakespeare, or he seems to refer to Shakespeare, because there's a character in history called John Oldcastle, and Shakespeare uses him in his drama in 3 of his plays. And Parsons talks about that, saying that John Oldcastle was a ruffian knight commonly brought on by comedians on their stages. So he seems to be referring to the way that Shakespeare uses John Oldcastle as Falstaff in his plays. So the character of Falstaff comes from the historical character, and Parsons notices it. And then there's this guy who made maps called John Speed, and he also comments on the relationship between these two, and he calls them this papist. A papist is a kind of bujoku, an insult for somebody who follows the Pope, a Catholic. This papist, he says, talking about Parsons, and his poet, talking about Shakespeare. This papist and his poet, he puts them together. All right? Of like conscience for lies, the one ever feigning and the other falsifying the truth. So he's attacking both of them together. So there seems to be quite a strong connection between the two of them. So where does that take us? Does it take us to Shakespeare being a Catholic or not? Well, firstly, let me say that that's not everything. There are more connections. For example, the poet Robert Southwell, who was a Catholic poet, put to death. Again, he was put to death. He was killed at that time. He and Shakespeare were clearly connected. Shakespeare clearly refers to Southwell's work. It's even possible that Southwell's poems were dedicated to Shakespeare. So there's quite a strong relationship there. And there are other relationships that we can make. But when it comes to the question of whether Shakespeare himself actually was a Catholic, my feeling is probably not. Okay, now you might be surprised after everything I've said there. I want you to be surprised. Okay? The reason I'm saying all of this is because I want to say this would be typical. These were not reasons for thinking that somebody was a Catholic. This is what everybody was living through. Okay, it is possible that he had Catholic sympathies. It's possible that he was a secret Catholic. And there are quite a lot of scholars who say that, including Father Peter Millward from this university, who retired from the Ebungapka just at the time that I joined it. And he and I, we meet about every 2 or 3 months and we argue about it, because he disagrees with me. Okay, but he's published lots of stuff on this. You can check him out. Okay, he's famous for this. He's famous for the idea that Shakespeare was a Catholic. So there are quite a lot of scholars who think that it's true that Shakespeare was a Catholic. But what we do know is that outwardly he didn't refuse to go to church. He went to the church, just like everybody else, the Church of England. And, all of this Catholic thing was fairly new. It was still, fairly closely behind people. That this new change into a kind of Church of England that was away from Catholicism and was more of a Protestant church. But in the past, everybody's father, everybody's grandfather, everybody's family had been Catholic. Most Elizabethans would have had, in fact, I think I could change that and say all Elizabethans would have had Catholic connections, because look at Queen Elizabeth herself. Her father, Henry VIII, he was a Catholic, basically. He got the Fidei Defensor, title from the Pope, Even though he had a quarrel with the Pope later on, he was basically a Catholic. Her sister Mary was a strict Catholic, okay? And so was her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. We'll talk about her in more detail later on. Even herself, Elizabeth, when Mary was the Queen, Elizabeth said, "Oh yes, I'm a Catholic." Okay, because if she said anything else, Mary might chop her head off. Okay, Mary burned and put to death many Protestants, and Elizabeth didn't want to be one of them. So, no, I'm a Catholic. Okay, but as soon as Mary died, she changed. So, even Elizabeth herself has very close connections, very close family connections with Catholicism, but she's not a Catholic. And I would say that this would be true for Shakespeare. This would be true for almost anybody living at that time. So let's just wind this up. The thing about it is that Queen Elizabeth was realistic. She didn't want to make windows into men's souls, as she put it. She didn't want to force people to say, I believe in Protestantism, I don't believe in Catholicism. No, don't try and force people to say anything. All right, it's like the American Army's policy on homosexuality until recently. Don't ask, don't tell. Just keep quiet about it. Don't talk about it. Okay? And that's what she was like. Just go to the church, go to my church, act like you believe in it, and that's all I ask. I don't know what's in your secret heart, and I don't want to challenge that. You have to believe whatever you want to believe. But as long as you act inside the law and go to my church, everything will be okay. So that was her basic condition. Go to the church and do what the Queen Elizabeth, what she asks in that respect. So just act like good Anglicans, even if you disagree in your heart. Now, it's possible that Shakespeare was such a person. But actually, I think that again, just as we saw that pendulum swinging backwards and forwards across the 16th century, I think that was happening inside people's heads as well. You know, they think, wait a minute, the church is saying this, and the Catholics say that, and if I get this wrong, I'm going to go to hell. What's the right way? That's certainly in the Bible. The Protestants are certainly right about that. But my father, if this is all wrong, my father was a Catholic until he died. Does that mean that he'll be in hell? You know, and people would spend their whole lives worrying about this at that time. It was a big thing for them. So, you know, I think the basic thing is that Shakespeare shows that he's interested in the subject. He's interested in both sides of the question. He's got close connections with both sides of his. I didn't go through all his Protestant friends and all his Protestant connections, okay? But that's also big, okay? So that was natural in those days. Everybody was living through that. I don't think it specially means that Shakespeare was a Catholic or not. All it means is that Shakespeare is typical of the way that people lived their life in those days. Some people would be sure, I'm sure I'm a Catholic, I'm sure I'm a Protestant. Most people would be, oh, I don't know, what's the right, heck, you know, this is a difficult question, all right? And if I get it wrong, I'm going to go to hell. So I really want to try to get it right, but I really don't know what the right way is. So I think there would have been a lot of people who were confused about what was the right way at that time. So, yeah, like I say, these religious questions are very important because people really believed in heaven and hell, and if they made the wrong choice here, if they supported the wrong church, they really thought that they would go to hell. You know, it mattered, it was important to them. So, you know, it mattered to Shakespeare just as it mattered to other people at the time. But the Queen herself didn't force people to say, you know, just keep all of that, you know, inside yourself. Of course, you know, the priests of the church, the Catholic priests and the Protestant ministers of the church, they would debate these questions openly, and they published huge, you know, publications about these questions. But for ordinary people, it was a time when most people kept their true heart, you know, look, this is my business. It's canke nai for the government, it's canke nai for anybody. This is my heart. Okay, I believe what I want to inside my own heart. All right? So I think we put Shakespeare along with most Elizabethans and most people of that Tudor period. The Catholic religion would still be there very much in the air around them. Their parents would have been Catholics. They would have friends who were Catholics, whether they were themselves Protestants or not. Okay? And they'd still be thinking about these religious questions. Okay? So I would prefer to see you know, this period as a time when all of these different things, these Protestant and Catholic ideas, they still continue. Never mind that the religion becomes Protestant, the Catholic ideas are still very strong in Elizabethan England and during the Tudor times. Okay, so that's about it. Obviously, you know, the one thing that is certain is that England became a Protestant country, but that Catholicism continued to have a strong influence. And As I said before, apart from that time under Oliver Cromwell, England was never a really, really strong Protestant country like some of the other parts of northern Europe. It always, kind of had a balance between Catholic and Protestant ideas. Okay, well, that's about it, really. So I'm going to finish there.